Welcome. My name is Sabine O'Neill, and I'm one of the SLDS trainers for the Georgia Department of Education. Today's SLDS session will be on social data. I hope you've logged into your SIS, your Student Information System, as well as your SLDS platform. If you haven't, please do so now. Following along with this recording will benefit you greatly, especially since I will be pausing in certain areas during the session to encourage you to look at the data that's in your own SLDS platform. Later in this presentation, you'll be asked to complete an electronic sign-in. This will be your ticket out the door. We will use that contact information to send you a certificate of attendance. You may share that certificate with your administration in case you need to show proof of having attended this particular session. I have launched my SLDS, and I'm taking this opportunity to assume that you also already have a general understanding of SLDS. If not, I suggest you stop this recording and watch the data overview video recording before proceeding with this one. So we're first going to start to look at attendance information inside of the social data area of the platform. The attendance tracker, as you see, is located on the right-hand side of your active schedule. You will note that your active schedule is listed showing your current schedule for the 2018-19 school year. However, if you look at the attendance tracker, we are in fact tracking attendance information based on last year's attendance. That's an important point and an important distinction to make. These are the students in your classroom this year. As you can see, I have 102 of them, but this is their attendance based on last year's attendance. Why is that helpful for me as a teacher? Usually it's going to help you determine which students are perhaps continuing a pattern, which students have developed some gaps, and if there are some gaps in that student's attendance, it may be cause or need for some differentiated instruction. Research shows us that an attendance pattern is generally established by the time a student gets to third grade. If you have a student who has shown chronic absenteeism over the last many years, very often research indicates that that student will start thinking about quitting school by the time they've reached 5th or 6th grade. According to the Georgia Department of Ed, more than 5 days of missed attendance may have an impact on that student's academic performance as well as school attitude. And did you know that in the 2015-2016 school year, Georgia students lost a total of 13.5 million days of instruction due to a total of absenteeism. So definitely attendance is an important factor. Now, we've broken attendance down into 4 distinct areas, or 4 distinct colors if you want. Students who have perfect attendance will be found in this green area. Those are your 0 absences. Students who have had 1 to 5 absences last year will be identified as falling into this yellow data point. Students who were absent 6 to 10 times last year will be noted in the orange section of the attendance tracker. And any student who had more than 10 absences last year, you will be able to find who those students are by identifying these or drilling into the red data point. Because of FERPA regulations, when you're looking at the attendance tracker, technically, as a teacher, you only have rights to drilling down into the information that's relatable to your classroom. What SLDS does is it does give you comparative data between what your classroom did or how the students in your classroom performed in their attendance last year and compare that to how they did across the school compared to how they did with the district and how they did comparatively to the rest of the state. So sometimes when I'm looking at the attendance tracker, I like to get a snapshot or an idea of how many of my students have been affected by lack of attendance. Very often, the one thing to do is to look at the percentages of students who actually missed more than 5 days last year. So when I use my attendance tracker to capture that information or to see that information, I can see that 36% of my students had 6 to 10 absences and 23% of my class had more than 10 absences. That means if I add both of those percentages together, I'm actually looking at 59% of my students had more than 5 absences last year. So this is where we're going to pause, and we're going to give you an opportunity to look at your own data inside of SLDS. So you can, by looking at the attendance tracker on your own teacher dashboard, you can determine the total percentage of students who missed more than 5 days last year. Remember, you're going to be adding both the percentage of students who had 6 to 10 absences as well as the percentage of students who had more than 10 absences. I'm going to pause the recording at this time so that you can go ahead and look at that data in your own platform. So were you surprised to find the number or the percentage of students in your classroom who missed more than 5 days last year? The next area that we're going to look into is actually a roster report. And that roster report is where we're going to be able to get information about how many days missed did our students actually have. So there are actually 2 ways. The more traditional way is for you to simply drill down into any of these data points and find out who those students are. Because if you drill down into any one of these data points, you will actually launch a roster report that will provide you the information about the absenteeism according to that variable that you've chosen. You can also choose to use the new All Students report that we have available as of this year. The All Students report will give you a roster of all the students that you teach, combining all the classrooms together. And you may also use that one to determine which students had the worst record of attendance last year. In my particular case, I'm actually going to drill down into my students who had more than 10 absences. So I will simply take my mouse and drill down into that red data point. It will take a couple of seconds, but you will see SLDS will load that roster report for you. Okay, as I mentioned, this report is showing me a roster of all students who had more than 10 absences last year. The thing with this roster report, however, is that the default sort is by student last name. And maybe that's not the way I want to look at my data. Perhaps I'd be more interested in finding or sorting my data based on the students with the worst attendance. So you'll note that across this report, there are a number of column headers. The one I want to concentrate right now is on the days absent column header. And you'll notice that there's a little black up and down arrow that's noted beside the days absent. I can simply click on that arrow to sort the data now based on this particular column header. Now the first time I click that little arrow beside days absent, it is going to sort the data. However, it is going to place, but the least amount of days missed is going to show at the top of this report. If I'd like to reverse that sort order so that I really can look at my students who had the worst attendance last year, I simply click on that arrow again where it says days absent, and it will resort the data, now giving me my students with the worst attendance up at the top of this list. So here you can see I have a number of students. My worst attending student missed 33 days last year. Along with the data relevant to attendance, I can also scroll over and take a look at how that student achieved on their milestones. Now, just a reminder that if you are teaching third grade and below, you will generally not see any achievement information here relevant to milestones. But if you are teaching either a repeating third grader and above, you will have access to viewing last year's assessment results. Along with the assessment results on this report, there are a number of other demographic or subgroups that I may be interested in identifying particular to this student. First of all, I may be looking to see whether this student has been listed as an SWD. If you hover with your mouse in front, on top of that column header and that acronym, we will display what that acronym stands for. In this case, it's Students with Disability. I also have a column relatable to Gifted, ED, which in this case stands for Economically Disadvantaged, ELL, which are my English language learners, a column also dedicated to military, SST, migrant, remedial. But the one that I want to concentrate on right now is the one that's marked as retained. This is a good time to remind you that if you see a Y or a yes in this column, it is not a guarantee to you that this student is retained. What this is basically telling you is that based on last year's information at the end of the school year, this student met all the criteria that your district has placed for the student to actually have been retained. However, you do know that sometimes you think a student should have been retained, and it turns out that that student actually doesn't get held back. So you will want to pay close attention to some of these demographic areas or some of these subgroups to identify some more information about these particular children or these students. So now it's time to pause so that you can have an opportunity to check your own database for absenteeism. I'll pause the recording here so you can transition over to your SLDS teacher dashboard and look for the top 5 students with the most absences in your database. Remember, you can choose to look at either the students who had more than 10 absences by drilling down into that red data point, or you can use the All Students Roster Report. Just make sure that whichever roster report you pull up, that you have made sure that you have sorted that option by days absent so that it can be easily identifiable for you as to which are the top 5 students who had the worst attendance last year. So we are now back, and my question to you is, were you surprised at the data that you could see in your roster report? Do you see a pattern with any of the students this year in your classroom as to whether they're repeating that pattern of absenteeism last year? So now that we've created a report listing the students with the most absences, you can now use that report to view an individual student's profile. You do this by launching the student's individual profile report. The profile report will permit you to see the student's attendance history, among other things. You can simply click on a student's name on this report, and that will launch the student's profile report. However, you do have a second way of finding information about a student. If you are looking for somebody outside of this report, or you are looking for a different student, you simply can scroll down to the bottom of the data page, and in any one of our SLDS data pages there is a search option available to you here at the bottom of the page. You can search by the student's GTID if you are aware of it. Otherwise, you can simply identify the grade that student is in. So if I'm teaching 7th grade, I'm looking for my 7th grade students. And then once I've chosen the grade, I will then have the next drop available to me beside that, which would be a roster of the students in my class. I simply choose a student's name, and I would hit the Go button, and it would also launch or take me to that student's profile report. Now the student I happen to look or want to view, his record is sitting here on my report. So I'm going to scroll back up to the top, and I'm looking at Marcel Hiller. That's whose data I would like to look at this point in time. So I'm going to click on Marcel's name link, that student's profile report. Now there's a plethora of data about the student available to you as his or her teacher. In today's session, social data, we don't have time to review all the various pieces of that data. However, if you are not familiar with the student profile and the data that's contained therein, you should make sure to attend either one of our live in-school training sessions wherein we will review the profile in more detail. If that's not available to you or you are unable to do that, then please make sure to spend some time viewing our other SLDS documentation or webinars so that you can get a greater understanding of what's in the student's profile report. Remember that all of the documentation and videos are available through that help and training link on the upper right-hand corner of the page. So now that I've launched this student's profile report, let's take a look first at the historical attendance data for this particular student. The attendance data lists information that may go all the way back to the 2005-2006 school year. Please note that data will not be available on this student if they've not been in a Georgia public school, meaning they were either homeschooled, private schooled, or schooled out of state. In those instances, you may see a gap in the data, or there'll be very little data available. So interestingly enough, on this longitudinal attendance chart, I can see there are some gaps here. I definitely see some gaps between 11-12 and 15-16. And then I see there's no information prior to 05-06. I mean, prior to the year 10-11. I do also see over here some demographic information. I know my student is in 7th grade. He's a male, white. I have a birth date. Remember, I have the flag here that he's been retained. And of course, I have his name. So here's the next exercise that I'm going to ask you to do on your own. It's time now for you to look at an individual student's historical longitudinal attendance information. I will pause the recording here so you can transition over to your SLDS teacher dashboard. Remember to click on the name of a student in the report you launched earlier in order to initiate or launch the profile report. Go ahead and take a look at that data now. Now, having looked at hopefully one of your worst attending students from last year, it's easy for you now to be able to identify whether that student has shown a pattern in their lack of attendance, or maybe what you discovered was that student just had a bad year last year. Either way, that longitudinal attendance information will give you a lot of insight. All right, so the next area we're going to review is the student's enrollment history. Not surprisingly, the enrollment history can also reveal to you a lot of information about your student. I generally like to see a boring history, as then I can assume perhaps that this student had a pretty stable school life, maybe attending the same schools throughout elementary, middle, and/or high school. But often you're going to find that that enrollment history is not boring. And that can lead you into some insight into this student you might not have known otherwise. So your enrollment history is available on the student profile. You simply need to keep scrolling down about 3/4 of the way down the profile. You'll get to this area here, which lists the enrollment history. When you're looking at enrollment history, it's good to note that we provide you with a lot of detailed information here. It's not limited to, but a lot of the information will be relatable to your dates of entry, withdrawal dates, schools attended, reasons for transfers, whether a student has been marked as needing to repeat a grade, if the student has a qualifying disability, is receiving services, has been identified as gifted, and so on and so forth. So let's take a look at this particular student's information. So I can see that back in 2010, this student started kindergarten. And then I immediately hone in on the fact that there are 2 first grade items here. So initially, my thought might be to assume that that student repeated first grade. However, if I look more closely at the detailed information here, I can see that after kindergarten, in August of the following year, that student was enrolled in first grade, and it looks like he had a withdrawal on December 17th of that same year. And if I just follow along, I can see that he transferred to another school in January and left that school in February and transferred out of state or out of the country. And you can see in correlation to the attendance information I had shown you previously, there's that gap. So it appears that 2nd, 3rd, and 4th grade, that student was not enrolled in a Georgia public school system. I mean, this student came back in 5th grade, started in September, which is a little late, went all the way through March, and in the middle of March, or towards the end of March, he was transferred again and completed that school year. So I know he completed 5th grade. Following year, he was enrolled in 6th grade. And I happen to know that he's a 7th grade student with me this year. And I can see that he was enrolled in 7th grade the year before and was never withdrawn. So I know that he completed 7th grade last year. So he definitely is a student who has been retained and is currently now in his 2nd time repeating 7th grade. So it's really important to hone in on the information on the enrollment history area to give you a better sense of what's been going on in that student's school life. Lastly is to look at the unofficial transcript information. The unofficial transcript will be found underneath the student's enrollment history. The information is useful in order to let you know what grades your students received in previous years regarding all the courses they've taken. High school students may even have the grade as well as the attained credit value for each course in their database. These grades are considered as unofficial, however, as they come from teachers' grade books and are uploaded with the standard SLDS data at the end of the school year on an annual basis. Now it's time for you to look at an individual student's historical enrollment and transcript information. So I will pause the recording here so you can transition over to your SLDS teacher dashboard. Remember, you'll be scrolling down about 3/4 of the way down the profile report to find the enrollment information, and then you'll scroll a little further down to find the transcript data. So one of the things that I haven't talked about yet inside of SLDS is what you can do with this data. So you can take any of the data that's available to you in the platform, so for instance this profile report, and you can export it out of the database into a different format. When would doing that be particularly helpful? Well, think about having either a teacher-parent meeting or a student-teacher meeting. Maybe you're involved in an RTI or an IEP meeting. Any reason in which you have to have contact with a person about a particular student, I would recommend that you seriously consider exporting the data from the SLDS platform. If you scroll up to the very top of our page, the toolbar that you'll find on the top of any of our data pages always includes our export feature, which is depicted by a floppy disk icon, or sometimes people will refer to that as the save icon. It doesn't really matter what you call it, just to understand that this particular tool is where you can export data. Right? So if I'm perhaps going to have a parent-teacher conference and I would like to make this data available to the parent, I might very well come into the export feature up at the top of the page, click on the menu, and choose to export this out to Word. Now, as you can see, there are other export options. I can export data out to Excel, as a PDF, a CSV file. These are just a variety of ways that I can export. But in this particular case, if I was going to be meeting with a parent and I wanted to discuss this child, I would go ahead and export this out to Word. I simply click on the Word document, and that will open up this profile report in a Word format. And as I mentioned earlier, the beauty of having this in a Word document is that you now have full editing rights to this particular document. So if you enable the editing, as I'm done now, place your cursor anywhere within the document and you can now edit the information. So perhaps I'm meeting with a parent and I want to track goals or notes for this particular student. I can go ahead and do that. Maybe I want to include a parent signature line and a date line. Those are all options available to me now when I export this data. Now, since I'm also in an electronic form of this document, I can actually use this document to upload it as part of my TEKS file or TEKS objectives. So why would I want to do that as a teacher? Well, if I make this document part of my TEKS objectives, I can use it to show my administrative staff how I'm using the data inside of SLDS to meet some of my TEKS objectives. Some of those objectives may be as simple as communication, professionalism, use of technology, use of data, differentiation. You can think of a number of ways that you can use this Word document as part of a supportive TEKS objective. All right, so that completes my SLDS social data video. And now that we've completed the presentation, you'll want to complete the electronic sign-in. Please open an internet browser and type in the below Google address. Pay close attention to the URL as it is case sensitive. You will want to type GOO.gl/ capital I, capital D, lowercase c, the number 2, capital J, and capital Q. Please be extra careful entering your email address. We will be using the contact information you gave us on this sign-in to send you your certificate of attendance. Should you have any additional questions regarding this video, training opportunities, or other SLDS features, please feel free to contact one of our SLDS team members. You can see my contact information is listed here. However, my contact information and the rest of the team's information can be found at the bottom of our help and training page, the one that I mentioned earlier in this recording. Thank you for attending this session on SLDS social data. I hope you found it informative.